manipulate and bypass anti-cheats and get control over the games process. After that, we're going to talk about different techniques I have tried against different anti-cheats, and all the disadvantages that each technique has, and how we could mitigate all these problems. And finally, the results, where I'm going to be releasing all the code that I wrote during the research, so it can be used like a good base to learn and get into this topic, because sometimes it's really hard to start debugging and reversing cheats. So first rule, if you're a gamer or you are playing a game, you may know that the first rule is you don't cheat. Or if you're going to do it, try to not get caught. That's actually not what happened to this player from India, which got caught in the middle of a tournament. He was, this is the moment where the admin of the competition approached to his machine to take over of the keyboard and the mouse, but this player quickly tries to delete some files from the system. So those were the files he tried to delete. Maybe he was writing a report, something for a security engagement, but probably not. It's kind of suspicious. And if you pay attention to the location of the executable and also the icon, it doesn't even have an icon, the executable. When we talk about cheats, and especially in a competitive scenario where people is getting paid for playing these games, it's really hard, and details are a key factor if you want to stay undetected and don't get caught. So the idea of that was to show you that this is a problem that actually affects a lot of companies, game developers, and it's also a professional scenario where people is getting paid by this, and it's a real problem. So now let's talk about the first part of this talk, is anti-cheats. Here you can see a lot of different logos or icons for multiple anti-cheats. Some of them belong to one particular game, but many of them can be used to integrate with any game you want. Usually anti-cheat developers bring an API so you can integrate properly with the game and defend all the features you want to protect from the game. Today we are going to talk about 3 of them, especially. The yellow one at the top on the first column is called BattleEye. The second one, the inspector, is sign code free, and the blue one is EasyAntiCheat. Those anti-cheats, you need to know that usually will have the same access level of an antivirus. They will have a driver running on ring 0, which will have full access to your system, file systems, and also all your processes. And this is quite interesting, because if we take a look to the numbers, we put together all the monthly active users for all these anti-cheats, these 4 anti-cheats, we can see that it's quite a lot of people who is trusting this software, installing them in order to play a game. To give you some real examples, here we have Battle Desert Online, which use the sign code free, the inspector one, as well as Lineage 2, that you may know. These 2 games have been on the market like quite a long time, more than 10 years. Then we have one of the last releases, Apex, together with Fortnite. They both use EasyAntiCheat. And finally we have Player Unknown Battlegrounds, which use BattleEye in order to protect the game. So now that we understand the different options we have, we need to see the main components that an anti-cheat may have or not. Some of them will be optional because they don't implement all the components, and of course the features that we are going to be talking about may go from one component to the other depending on how it's implemented. But first of all, we have a server, an anti-cheat server, which will be managing all the heartbeat connection with each agent that is running at the same time of the game. So if this heartbeat is disconnected in somehow because the process crashed, the service of the anti-cheat has been disconnected, it will automatically kill the game also, so no one can play without the anti-cheat. And also we'll be receiving all the alerts and reports for playing that have some malicious or weird behavior on their PC. Then we are going to have like the most powerful part of an anti-cheat, and it's the driver that they will be running in ring 0. This driver will give them a lot of power because they can use it, for example, to register different kernel callbacks. So when a new event is appear on the system, like for example a process is created, they can get that event and execute some pre and post operations. And for example, if the process is trying to get a handle to the process of the game, they will try to downgrade that handle or reject the access, so another process are not able to manipulate the memory of the game. Another thing they do is also control different flags in the kernel structure, so they know if some kernel or user mode are debugging the system, and also will manage all the protections to key services like LSAS and CSRSS, as we are going to see later. Another feature will be a DLL, which will be running inside of the game, in the context of the game. Usually, anti-cheats load a main DLL packet with them.Protect or what the packet you want, and then they start loading in unmapped region of memory with the stripped headers, multiple DLLs with different modules that will take care of different functions and will manage specific tasks. So one of some examples of those tasks are control that any thread has been hijacked, identify if the import address table has been manipulated to hook some functions, some features of the game, inspect each region of memory, control that any executable region has been created or new threads are being running on the context of the system. And then we will have the last part of the anti-cheat that will be an external process running in ring 3, which is going to be running at the same time also that the game is running. This process will usually brute force all the process IDs, try to access to all the memory of each process, looking for malicious signatures, to try to detect well-known cheats, and prevent from another programs to access to the main game. So now that we understand some of the main components from anti-cheat, we need to see the other part, which are the cheats. And if you have played a game and you know that feeling when you see someone running across the map like full speed or always aiming in your head and you say, come on, what's going on here? There is something weird. So we need to understand what cheats need to do in order to bring all these capabilities to any user. And a way to classify a cheat could be depending on how it's integrated with the process, with the game process. One could be an internal one, which will be a DLL injected in the game. As you may know, there are multiple ways to inject the DLL. You can use a small shellcode to load manually your DLL, and if you're doing these things well and well prepared, it's really hard to detect when someone is inside and you have to scan the whole process trying to find if something is weird inside. Of course, it's going to be quicker because we will be running in the process context. On the other side, the external one will be another process running at the same time, which will be constantly reading and writing memory from the game. This, of course, will make it slower and easy to detect because the ways to access a process are well known in Windows, and it's easier to maybe prevent this to happen. Another way of classifying cheats is because of their goal. Here we have some examples of aimbots, which will usually assist the user to aim better. So when a player is trying to shoot someone, it will correct the aiming, so it's always pointing to the head of the enemy and will always aim a perfect shoot. This kind of cheats usually will need to read and write the memory of the process because they will usually need to locate all the enemies, the array of objects for the enemies, then locate the position in the game and do all the calculations they need in order to fix the aim in a 3D war. In order to fix the aim in the position of the crosshair, they will also need to write memory in order to fix the offsets of the crosshair. Another example could be wall hacks or ESP, which is extra sensory perception. These games usually will bring more information than the game does. For example, we'll reveal enemies behind the walls, modify the models of the enemies or are painted as red, and you can clearly see them on the distance. We'll also usually hook the graphic engine of the graphic engine in order to, each time that the frame is being rendered on a game, they can add all this additional information they need to the game. As a real example, here we have one case which got famous because he was a streamer, well-known streamer, which got caught because the anti-cheat got reflected on his glasses. So he was streaming, the game appeared to be normal for all the people who was in the audience, but suddenly some of the people who was watching the stream started looking at his glasses and noticed that the model were being rendered as red and behind the walls. So this is a way to show you that this is a real thing that is happening, and you could be got caught even if you are taking all the precautions to stay undetected, right? And finally, we have like the automatization and utility cheats will bring you a bunch of different things like leveling, like teleporting, unlimited health, whatever you can imagine. They will try to use it to bring you like more features than the game does. So now that you all understand how these two things work, I want to explain you how I got here. Last year, with two friends from Immunity, we decided that we want to reverse a cheat. So we said, let's go for Lineage 2. It's a game we played when we were younger, and we started like looking on the market. And we went for a cheat developed in Russia from only one guy that has been in the market like 10 years maybe, and was bypassing all the anti-cheats. So we found a free version on the internet, and we started like digging and seeing what's going on. After some reversing, we saw that the cheat was injecting a DLL with a small shellcode, which will load the DLL inside of the game, and we'll have a command and control interface, which was a third process, an external process. There was some hidden communication between the DLL and the process, and of course, all the binaries and the DLLs were encrypted, we're using VM protection, well, also written in Delphi, which is awful to reverse. Once we got an idea of the cheat, we saw that he was using name pipes in order to communicate between the command and control interface and the DLL. Since we couldn't find any good tool to proxy this name pipe, we decided to go ahead, write our own proxy. We could hook and start seeing all the messages that this external command and control interface was sending to the DLL. And all what you can see here are the raw packages that were being written on the name pipe. After some more reversing of the game, we saw that what actually was doing the cheat was hooking the main feature to send and receive packages on the game. So all that you see here are the raw messages that the game is taking, ciphering, and sending to the server. Once we got a real knowledge of the cheat, we decided to go for the new version. So we contact Daniel, our friend from Russia, and we bought the cheat, the last version. That's when we noticed some differences. We saw that he was not using name pipes anymore, and he was using file mapping. Okay, we found this interesting, but we didn't know why he was changing all these different things. So that's when we decided to, or I decided to continue with cheats, with anti-cheats, and I started looking at the market and how every anti-cheat works, so I could understand why he was doing this kind of stuff. So the first thing I noticed was that there is a lot of money on the market. There is people, organizations making more than $1 million per year sending cheats for different games. There are private and public communities which ask you for an interview in Discord or Skype in order to be, if you are a trustful client and you're not going to reveal the cheat to the public. They usually prevent or apply a lot of obfuscations to the cheat so you don't reverse it and you don't know how they are bypassing the anti-cheats. I thought about all that market and I started thinking about what are game developers and anti-cheat developers doing in order to prevent all this stuff. So I took a look to the Apex numbers and I saw that they have claimed to ban that amount of people in the last month. This was 2 months ago, so now maybe the numbers are even higher. And it's okay, it's a huge number, but 3 weeks after Apex was released, for example, someone, what I believe is accidentally, disabled the heartbeat from the anti-cheat. So after that, people just renaming the executable of the game could bypass the whole anti-cheat and play without the anti-cheat even running. So it's quite curious that all this effort is being made to protect the games and then some mistake like this happen. And actually, if we talk about Code 3, the inspector one, these anti-cheats usually load the process, unprotect it, and apply all the protections while the anti-cheat is loading. And that gives you actually a quite frame of time where you can manipulate this process. And if you do that, you are inside of the game, and if you're doing things well, no one will notice this. So something is weird is going on. I decided to go ahead and start looking about the different techniques to bypass anti-cheats and see and apply them on different ones to see which one were the results. So first, I start thinking about the goal. So if I want to bypass an anti-cheat, I will need to read, write, and allocate memory on the game, depending if it's internal or external. If it's internal, I could just allocate memory to write my shellcode and then load my DLL. But if I'm external, I will need to find a way to open a handle to the process and start reading and writing memory in order to get the information I need and also manipulate the game so I can send actions, for example, to the game. And if I'm being internal, I will need to run this DLL in the context of the game. And of course, we need to be as stealth as possible, which means that we need to delete all our traces, create new handles, or so if the anti-cheat is scanning each process on the system, we need to make sure that the anti-cheat doesn't detect our process manipulating the game. So first of all, I went and started looking at hijacking techniques. Anti-cheats usually protect the game, so any other processes can get a handle, or if they get a handle, this handle will have so low privilege that won't be able to read and write the memory of the game. But there are some exceptions, like the LSAS or CSRSS from Windows, which if they don't have a handle to a process, the system just crashes. So this has been a problem for quite a long time to anti-cheat, until they discovered that maybe downgrading the access to the handle, they could keep this handle from these these protected processes from Windows, and maybe integrate with the system and control some of the stuff that's going on that process. So imagine this scenario. We have LSAS, which already has a handle to the process, which they need to allow this to happen, and we have the game, whatever game you want. And then we are going to have our external cheat. So the main idea will be to stand inside of LSAS and start reusing this handle in order to read and write the memory of the game. In order to send all the actions we want to our program or DLL that is running inside of LSAS, we will need some kind of hidden communication. So, as Daniel did, we also tried name pipes. We went ahead and started seeing how we could implement this, and if you the thing that you see here is how a handle for a name pipe is usually seen on the system. So by using this handle, we inject it inside of LSAS, and we got our first bypass. We bypassed Code 3 for Black Desert, and this one was quite easy. But after analyzing what's going on, here, for example, on the screenshot, you can see that on the LSAS process, it has a handle to our name pipe, and on the console has all the actions that we were trying to implement on this with this DLL inside of LSAS. I develop this in a way that I send in a request, and this DLL execute each read or write action using different Windows API from user mode. So analyzing this, I saw that there were a lot of disadvantages on this method. And maybe that was why they moved and stopped using this technique. The first one is that we are creating a new handle on else's. So if the anti-cheat is analyzing this process, it's quite obvious that we are doing some kind of weird stuff inside of this process. The second one is that anti-cheats usually hook all the user mode win APIs, so they can get all the control of the work of the flow of the execution. And if you are calling write virtual memory, for example, they are going to get that action, send it to their driver, analyze if this is an expected behavior or not, and take actions against that. The third issue is that if we are running a shellcode or we have injecting a DLL inside of else's, there is going to be a new thread that is going to be running in an expected context, maybe in an unmapped region of memory, and that's something that is quite easy to detect. And finally, there is something that I already mentioned, is that anti-cheats usually downgrade all the handles. They do that by using the driver. They register pre and post operations. So when a new handle is created, they can analyze which privilege this handle is requesting and modify them so it doesn't have the required privilege to manipulate the process. The next step was to go and try another different communication, and this one was using file mapping. So we stopped using name pipes and we moved to file mapping. Why? Because file mapping will allow us to have a shared memory between two processes, but without having a new handle. And how this is possible? Because if you read the documentation from Microsoft, you will see that when you create a file mapping, when you call this API, you are going to get a handle to the file mapping. But this handle can be closed as long as you don't call and map your file. So if you keep the reference to the shared memory and close the handle, you can keep using this shared memory between two different processes. So the idea will be to create the shared memory, connect our cheat with the else's, and then close the handle in both ways. So with that, if the anti-cheat is analyzing all the handles from each process and also including else's, won't see any handle or any new handle. The way of doing that, or manipulating the shared memory, or using the shared memory, will be to having a structure where we can send all the requests and responses that we need to our program running inside of else's. But the thing is, in order to prevent the race condition, we will need some kind of spin locks or mutex. But all these features from Windows also requires handle. The way to avoid having these new handles would be to manually use a spin lock, for example, using the last byte from the shared memory to write 1 and 0 and prevent a race condition. And one interesting thing is that we can do all these things before even the game is running. So we can create a shared memory, delete all our traces, and then when the game starts analyzing the processes, they don't have any idea what's going on because we have delayed all the execution of what have been done. So trying this, here we can see on the screenshot that the cheat or the program I was using, the external one, which has a name, I don't know why did I choose, but so we are that there has no new handle to the process, to a shared memory. There is no evidence that this program is communicating with another program on the system. And of course, in the console, you can see all the actions that this DLL inside of else's is doing and sending the responses back to our program. With this, we solved the first problem that we got, that we had new handles when we tried to create a shared memory. And also, we don't have any handle to the game process, which is quite important. Now, the second problem we have is that usually cheats hook all the user modes win APIs. Here we have an example of EasyAntiCheat where they inject a DLL inside of else's, And the main purpose of this DLL is to hook all the functions or the from Windows that are used to read and write memory of a process. For example, here is hooking nt read, write, and alloc virtual memory. So when you call this any of these APIs, they will take control of what's going on and validate if you're doing something that is not expected. But if you take a look to the implementation of any of these calls in Windows, you will realize that it's quite simple. So maybe we could implement this by calling the syscalls directly, so we don't use any API from user mode of Windows, and any of those hooks will actually work for us if we are directly calling the syscall. So I go ahead, I implemented this with 3 lines of assembly, and I start using a reading from Elsas without using any of the user mode win APIs, which was actually quite practical to bypass all these hooks. So we have the second prompt solved in this case. Now I want you to keep in mind these 2 problems, because now I want to show you a different technique that will help us to understand how we could bypass all these 2 problems. Hooking, right? When a game is trying to manipulate the information rendered by the game, it will usually, for example, render some function from the graphic engine, like DirectX, and we'll do that in order to be there each time that the frame is being rendered. So each time that something is going to be displayed or render is going to be shown, the cheat can be there, adding information or manipulating the models of the different objects inside of the game. In order to do that, the usually ways to hook one of these functions could be modifying the import address table or placing a jump at the beginning of the function we want to hook. However, as Anti-Cheats knows that this is a well-known technique, they usually start scanning all these functions that are usually hooked, and also they validate that no one modifies the import address table. But anti-cheats need to bring some compatibility with external processes. For example, if you have played any game that uses Steam, you may know that if you click like Shift-Tab, Steam will display all the chats and your friend information inside of the game. And that's actually what it's doing in order to display all this information, the same that a cheat will need to do in order to modify the rendering process of the game. Another example would be Open Broadcaster software, which is a software using for streaming, which also will need to hook any of these DirectX functions or whatever is the graphic engine in order to get all the video from the game and redirect it to YouTube or Twitch. So taking that into account, I start analyzing these softwares, and I saw that the main DLLs you injected into the process to create these hooks and bring these functionalities to the user were hooking the main feature from DirectX, which was the function present. Present is a function that is being called each time that the frame is being rendered inside of the game. So the way they were doing is they were placing a jump that was pointing to their module, their whitelisted DLL. So I start thinking about this, and I start reversing the Steam DLL. And I thought, what would happen if I try to place my hook inside of the Steam DLL instead of the game? Imagine that creating signatures for the game will be really easy because everything is under control of the game developers and the anti-cheat, but keeping all the changes that the external programs are making every day or keeping each update, it's quite hard work for anti-cheats company and also game developers. And maybe if you modify or manipulate this region of memory, it will be hard to be detected. So after reversing the DLL, I found this function, which was the function that they were using to replace the original present function from DirectX. By doing that, I decided to go ahead and start reusing all these DLLs from third-party applications to put all my hooks inside of those applications. Actually, they didn't notice this. I could inject and render information inside of the different games without being detected. And if you pay attention or a closer look to this DLL, since they are now under control of the game developers and anti-cheat developers, they always will have some different problems. And in this case, for example, the stream application, you have different code caves and use name pipes to redirect all the video from the game. If you don't know what the code cave is, it will be a portion of an executable memory, region of memory, which will be full of zeros. And why this is interesting? Because maybe we could use this region full of zeros to place our shell codes or our code, and then when we create a new thread or hijack an already existing thread inside of the game or else, we could actually run a thread inside of an expected context. So this thread will be running inside of the region memory of a whitelist DLL. With that, we could use this and we could also, for example, overwrite some portion of this DLL to inject all the information there and hijack a thread. This could be also applied to ELSAs, overwriting some portions of an external another library from Windows. We have to think that if we are manipulating ELSAs, it's a process which is really well known, and even if we use a code cave or we use a DLL from Windows to overwrite some functions that are not being used, this is quite easy, or maybe it's possible that they detect us. So we need to be very careful when we do this kind of stuff. But, however, in order to bypass the last problem, we needed to move to kernel. Why? Because we saw that the anti-cheats were using the driver in order to downgrade in kernel mode all the handles we have, even the else's handle. So cheaters also develop their own cheats or abuse from already existing cheats in order to run code in kernel mode and try to manipulate the system in order to bring or bypass the kernel protection from anti-cheats. There are a few ways to run code in kernel mode. One could be enable test mode, but of course anti-cheats will validate the flags, and if the system is running in test mode, they won't launch even the game, and that's not a good way. The second one could be signing your own drivers, but this is a lot of money, and also if they see which signature you are using to sign your cheats and sell them, that's a dead end. And the third option will be to abuse of an already existing driver. That could be a CVE that is well known, or also a 0-day. Cheats nowadays are using a lot of 0 days in order to load their code in kernel and prevent for being detected. Why? Because anti-cheats usually generate a list of blacklist drivers, and they use all this information to analyze all the cache tables from kernel and check if any vulnerable driver or blacklisted driver has been loaded previously also. And there is a fourth option which will be manipulating the kernel structures of the kernel, loading our unsigned driver and patching the kernel before patchware get us. But this is kind of unstable, and sometimes it's not the best approach. So I went with this one, the third one, and analyzing the handles already existing in ELSAs. Here you have an example where EasyAntiCheats downgrade the handle for Apex. The process you are seeing on the blue line is the Apex process, and if you pay attention to the desired access, you will know that this is much restricted than the rest of the processes. Usually, anti-cheat will remove all the flags that will allow to read, write, or that the access required to call Windows APIs that manipulate memory of a process. So the first idea was to go for a vulnerable driver that will allow us to create a handle from kernel mode. So I took a look to Synapse, which is the driver for the Razer mouse, had a CVE from 2 years ago, and I developed a small exploit to abuse from this driver and call to setW open process and get a handle from kernel mode by passing all the protections from user mode. The thing is that sometimes anti-cheat implement protections, and when you call this handle from user mode and you try to use it, they will also get you. This method didn't work very well with all the anti-cheats I was testing, so I decided to move further and try a different technique. The next thing that I tried was to abuse from the GIGABYTE driver. There is a vulnerable version of this driver from 1 year ago, which has a lot of vulnerabilities, but there are two which are really interesting. The first one will allow us to have a mem copy in ring 0, and providing two virtual address, being on kernel on user mode, it will allow us to map different buffers from one way to the other. So if we want to read some structure in kernel mode, we can map that structure if we know the virtual address and see that information on the user mode. And the second vulnerability will allow us to read and write arbitrary physical memory from the system. And this is quite interesting because by using this vulnerability, we could start scanning all the physical memory, looking for useful information for us, so we can find stuff or usable structures, kernel structures inside of the kernel memory. Again, the vulnerability was that users without enough privilege are able to call and get a handle to the driver. So how does usually this process work? The idea will be to perform a decom attack that is a direct kernel object manipulation. And the main idea will be to look for the already existing handle that LSAS has and, for example, upgrade the access from the handle. So if this handle has been restricted when it was created, maybe we can later manipulate the handle and keep process all access and have complete access to the memory of the process. In order to do that, the steps to implement this attack will be the following. First, we will get a handle to the vulnerable driver, and with this driver, we are going to start using the second vulnerability to read physical memory from the system, and we are going to start going all through the memory, the physical memory of the system. By doing that, we are going to start looking for some interesting patterns. In this case, what we want to find is the LSAS process. So here you have an example of a small structure that will allow us to implement this required pattern. The first attribute is going to be the image file name, that for LSAS is lsas.executable, and then the priority class will be 2, which this number is always constant on LSAS process. So by looking this structure in the physical memory, we are going to be able to allocate the eProcess structure for LSAS. Once we have this address for this structure, we just need to calculate some offsets inside of eProcess structure so we can get the pointer of object table, which this pointer will be pointing to the handle table. With handle table, we contain all the information of the handles that belong to that process. So now we are one step closer of finding our handle we need inside of the kernel memory. Then, in order to resolve the specific address for a handle, we could use the exp lookup handle table entry. This function is implemented in N2 as kernel executable, and if you take a look and reverse this executable, you will find that the things that you need in order to implement this function from user mode are to read and write physical memory and to mem copy virtual address on the system, and are the two things we already have. So the idea is to manually implement that. It's quite simple. And once we have this function, we are going to provide two parameters: the handle table that we already have, this pointer, and the number of the handle we want to get. By doing this, this function will return us the virtual address on kernel of this handle, And again, using the mem copy, we will be able to map this region of kernel memory into user. The only thing we have to do now is to override the granted access and give, for example, processor access, and then map again that buffer to the kernel memory. Once we have done that, we can maybe upgrade the handle of the process. Here you have a screenshot where I'm mapping, if you can see, the access for one random handle inside of Elsa's, inside of the user memory. This is the debugger from Visual Studio. So by doing that, I implemented all the exploits and the steps in order to do this, and luckily I could bypass EasyAntiCheat, which was other of the cheats, the anti-cheats I was analyzing. And in this case, I could get access to all the region memories and manipulate the memories of the game Apex. This, you have to think that it's quite interesting, because if the anti-cheats knows about this, could maybe later try to analyze all the handles and detect if any of those of the interesting handles they are controlling has been modified. That's true, but also you have to think that since we are running code in kernel mode and we could use any driver we want, or maybe a 0-day we have for this, it's we could maybe do another kind of crazy stuff, like finding the game actually directly from kernel and performing all the write and read actions directly from kernel, and don't even having a handle in user mode. So of course this option will be not so stable, so I decided to go for this option and try it. And actually for BattleEye this worked, but depending on what you are trying to do inside of the process, they maybe will give you a blue screen because they detect some weird behavior going on. So for BattleEye, probably the mapping directly the game of the process from kernel will be the best option. With this, I could delete all these problems. But if we think about this, we need to know that for blacklisting drivers for anti-cheats, it's quite complex. They can't know, they can't be aware of all the vulnerabilities that are around. They even can't know about the 0 days that are being used. So they always will have these disadvantages against these kind of things. And as conclusions about all this process that we got in order to bypass all these problems that these techniques have, we get to know that always probably cheats and anti-cheats will end fighting on kernel mode, abusing from different drivers or 0 days to load their code. That sometimes it could be trivial, like renaming a file or maybe reusing a handle, as we saw with sign code 3. But sometimes it will be quite more difficult, and we will have to defeat different controls. And we need to know also that all these bypasses are partial bypasses. Why? Because being able to read and write memory of the game is not all what we need. We also need to be stealth and undetected inside of the process. Because if we are already inside, but we manipulate a value of the game that the anti-cheat is also controlling, that will trigger some alerts on the anti-cheat. But that's a different history, because because you will need to particularly analyze the anti-cheat for a game and see which flags from the game or which region of memory the anti-cheat is analyzing particularly for that game. And most important is that the compatibility with Windows and third-party applications will always be a problem. Manage all the changes that this application have in real time or are updating every week is really hard for anti-cheat developers. We will probably use all these features they need to provide in order to abuse and get advantage against all the controls they perform. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to be releasing all the code, because starting to analyze anti-cheats or how they work usually take a lot of time. You will need first a lot of time creating cheats, so you can know how to implement each feature for a cheat. Then you will need to move and start trying to reverse a program which actually is a rootkit, which is going to be controlling everything inside of your computer, and you can't even open a debugger. So when you start to trying to do this kind of stuff, it's really hard if you don't have any information on internet. And the information that you can find will be for people publishing on a forum that this is my technique, but the entry level to get reversing this kind of software is kind of hard. So the idea will be to release all this code so you can use it as a template to learn and start learning about the different techniques and how an anti-cheat works, and you can basically has been developed in a way that you can just compile it and use it on any anti-cheat. And if you want to modify, for example, the exploit, it's everything prepared for that. So it will give you the capabilities to start learning about anti-cheats. I think it should be already public on the GitHub. And well, that was all. So thank you for being here. Any question? Thanks. I don't know where is the mic for.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting.
Thanks.
I think a lot of the techniques you mentioned in your talks, such as the GIGABYTE driver and referencing EXP handle lookup table, had been previously publicly documented. Were there any helpful resources you used to help do your development?
Actually, if you pay attention to the techniques, are malware techniques. Usually, since you are fighting against a rootkit, you will need also to go so deep as the rootkit is working in kernel. All this information, you can usually find it on forums or from cheater developers that usually publish some information, but most of them just release like reuse of handle, and then they stop talking because, of course, anti-cheat companies are there too reading, even on the private and the private communities where they sell the cheats. They are there trying to buy cheats so they can reverse them and analyze them. So I basically start like digging on these forums, going hours on hours reading what they were talking about, and then after that trying that by myself and being how I test fail or succeed, and so on. That was actually. Thanks. So I think there is one more.
Hey, so you talked a lot about actually bypassing anti-cheat, and I was wondering if you looked in, or what your thoughts are on obfuscation of the actual game process, or if anything made it difficult to actually write the cheats themselves.
Yeah, actually, not only games are usually obfuscated. They usually have like them.This or them.Protect. But the thing is that by using all these techniques, sometimes you don't need to worry about that if you are not developed the cheat. When you need to move and develop a cheat and start like providing different features, of course you are going to be, you will need to reverse the game and start analyzing how the memory of the game works. Anti-cheats also are usually encrypted on also using them.Protect or any packer. So what I usually did is, for example, if they were using them.Protect on some stuff, start dumping region of the memory to start analyzing that process once has been loaded in memory. It's quite tough work, but you can go doing, you can do it. It's possible.
Hi, thanks, great talk. I was just wondering, during your research, how did you like get around getting hardware banned and having to start up everything?
Yeah, actually, I have another computer which I use to all this stuff, because most of the anti-cheats also perform hardware driver, hardware ID bans. Usually, the hardware ID are quite simple, and if you try to look for what the information they're trying to grab, like disk names, drivers, versions, all this information is usually easy to spoof. So if you want to like focus on a game or start analyzing a game, it probably you will need to reverse this hardware ban and create like a hook to spoof all this information so that you don't get banned. But yeah, I use another computer, so my computer with the one I use don't get banned on everything. Okay, so thank you everyone.